So hey guys, I'm Nidhi. I'm going to give a talk today on compassion fatigue. Also, another way to consider it is empathic distress fatigue. I'd like to thank the social EM crew, Doctors Kendall, Sim, Warshaw, Fierbeck, Lavadera, and Pula, and hopefully I didn't forget anyone from the list. So it's 2 a.m. on an October night in 2021, and I'm walking into room 10 with an oxygen mask. Mrs. R, who's in her 50s, is satting at 84% on room air, and her Liat is about to come back positive. I think you have COVID, Mrs. R. She looks at me with disgust. There's no way I have that virus. Did you get the vaccine, I ask? She looks at me again, blank. No, I'm not letting someone put that in me. I have a friend who knows someone who got sick from that, and I read online that it doesn't even work. I feel my breath quicken, and I can feel my stomach kind of twist and roll up, and I can taste it in the back of my throat. And I just look at her, and I scream. I let it all out. Don't you get it? I ask her rhetorically as a tear runs down my face. You're the reason why. You are the reason why, I shout. But I don't. I actually don't say anything. I just look at her blank, walk over, connect the nasal cannula to the wall, place it on her face, and walk out of the room in silence. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about compassion fatigue, and I want this to be interactive. It's like an open forum as well. So if anyone has anything to add, either while I'm speaking or towards the end, please participate, okay? Oh wait, I'm trying to change this. Okay, so just kind of like the plan for today, we're going to talk about what compassion fatigue is, why we experience it, how do we manage it, and how can we combat it. So what is compassion fatigue? We hear it thrown around a lot. Compassion fatigue is a state experienced by those helping people in distress. It's an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped to the degree that it can create secondary traumatic stress for the helper. Research from the Social Neuroscience Lab of Dr. Tanja Sanger of the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Germany shows that compassion fatigue is kind of a misnomer, and rather it's empathy that fatigues in caregivers, not compassion. So how do we differentiate the two? How do we differentiate empathy from this compassion? So what's empathy? Tricia Dowling writes that empathy is a mental construct that allows us to resonate with other people's positive and negative feelings. Dr. Sanger actually studied pain-related empathy in married couples using functional MR imaging. And her team observed when painful stimulus was applied to the hand of one partner, the reaction that their other partner had when they could see and hear their partner's reaction. Her team found that areas of the anterior insula and the anterior middle cingulate cortex were activated both when subjects received pain and also when they observed their partner experiencing pain. So Dr. Singer concluded that part of the pain network associated with its emotional qualities mediates empathy for suffering. So experiencing pain and the knowledge that a beloved partner is experiencing pain actually activate the same emotional brain circuits. So in practice, it's really important that in empathy, we feel with the other person, but that we don't confuse ourselves with the other. We still know that the emotion we resonate is the emotion of the other person. And if you're unable to distinguish that from the other person from our own, we kind of move into something called empathic distress. In contrast, compassion is feeling warmth, concern, or care for another person. Rather than with the other person. Unlike empathy, compassion increases activity in the areas of the brain involved in dopaminergic reward and oxytocin related affiliated processes. This enhances positive emotions in response to adverse situations. Because compassion generates positive emotions, it counteracts negative effects of empathy elicited by other suffering. There was an article published out of Australia in 2020 suggesting that perhaps compassion fatigue is a misnomer and should rather be described as empathic distress syndrome. Compassion and empathy have long been proven to improve healthcare patient satisfaction outcomes, and clinical well-being. Compassionate care addresses that patient's need for connection and relationships and is based on attentive listening and desire to understand the patient's perspective. Neuroscientists such as Kamiki and Singer that I mentioned earlier have shown that compassion doesn't cause fatigue, but rather empathic distress fatigue is triggered when that self-other distinction that we've been talking about is blurred. It's an acute onset of personal suffering linked to an intense sharing of another's negative emotions that often results from working in traumatic situations or witnessing others' distress. Symptoms include lack of empathy, anxiety, irritability, anger, persistent arousal, dread of work, and avoidance. Personally, I know that I found it very difficult this past summer, like in 2021, and in early fall when I would speak to patients, such as the one that I talked to, that I mentioned earlier in the lecture, because I found it difficult distinguishing their feelings towards the vaccine with my own. And I almost felt like them not understanding was the equivalent of me not understanding. And it made me very anxious and angry and dread coming to work, just like kind of like what these scientists are describing. Dr. Christina Maslach, known for her work on occupational burnout and creating the Maslach burnout inventory, describes that burnout is a psychological syndrome that involves emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and a diminished sense of personal accomplishment that occurs during various professions who work with other people in challenging situations. In Maslach's view, burnout undermines the care and professional attention given to patients or clients of human service professionals. There's no consensus on the measurement of burnout, but Dr. Maslach did create the Maslach burnout inventory that I can send out later on and you guys can go through it. And it's most commonly used as an instrument for measuring burnout. Her inventory captures 3 dimensions of burnout specifically: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal accomplishment. In 2020, a paper was published in Italy investigating the stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue of healthcare workers early in the pandemic in Villa dei Pini, located in Italy, from March to April 2020. And the study found that significant compassion fatigue and burnout percentages were present in several different groups. Most of the studies that are out regarding compassion fatigue focus on nursing staff in emergency rooms and quick care. I didn't actually find too many during my research of specifically for like emergency care providers or quick care providers or residents. The study also found that higher levels of education can protect workers from the risk of developing high levels of work stress. EDs are a breeding ground for compassion fatigue and burnout. Working in the fast-paced environment presents a unique collection of departmental and patient stressors that are physically and emotionally demanding. And most of these stressors that I have listed above are things that we probably deal with on a day-to-day basis, like higher acuity, complex cases, high patient turnover, ED overcrowding, performance measures and targets, access blocks, and then patient factors like violence, aggression, dying patients, trauma, critically unwell patients, frequent attenders, and pediatric resuscitations. And then there's also barriers to compassion. Researchers have identified 3 major barriers to doctors maintaining compassion, which illustrates why emergency workers are likely to encounter compassion fatigue during their careers. So these are things that we all get all the time, distracting phone calls, interruptions from colleagues, trauma and recess callouts, difficult patients that could be rude or hostile, aggressive or violent, and like I said earlier, frequent attenders, language or cultural barriers, and then clinically complex situations like the tendency to become more analytical and less caring when things get complicated. Flight attendants remind us to put on our own oxygen masks before we help others, meaning secure your own safety before you have to help anyone else. But on the ground, so many care providers don't take the time to take care of our own needs. After recognizing the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue within ourselves, it's important to develop a multi-pronged approach. In addition to seeking professional support, we can also create a self-care plan to help put ourselves on a road to recovery. When we think about self-care, remember that we need to address 6 core areas. Oops, let's change. Physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, professional, and relational health. I just want to preface before we go into all of these categories that while I think it's great to talk about this to help counter compassion fatigue, I also understand that it's frustrating because most of the resources that are out there really focus on like healthcare wellness and countering the fatigue. And as residents, we can often feel powerless because there's not that much out there to prevent it, because all the things that we mentioned before, such as the stressors contributing to compassion fatigue and the barriers to compassion, those are often out of our ability to change. And I know that ideally you'd want to fix those and not just continue those and have to find a way to counter them, but not really sure if there's a faster way to kind of combat that or prevent that from happening. So for physical, commit to a healthy lifestyle, create a calming space to come home to, create bedtime routines, stick with them, find a physical activity that you enjoy, take time away for work, for vacation, and for visiting family and friends. Psychological, work with a counselor or therapist, journal about your days, and leave the bad experiences on the page. Think about positives at work, confide in friends or colleagues, and decrease stressful situations in our personal life. Emotional, spend time with the people that we love, create a list of self-affirmations, which sounds stupid, but actually like works and it feels kind of good sometimes. Make sure to laugh and cry and don't hold emotions in. Find an enjoyable volunteer activity or keep a running list of moments that make you feel strong throughout your day. Spiritual, listen to or watch inspiring music or programming, spend time in nature, create lists of things that give you hope, post inspirational quotes in your personal space, meditation. And for those of you who are religious, you can always turn to religious spiritual leaders or religious spiritual groups or texts. Professional, alter shift patterns, take plenty of breaks, which I know we're all really bad at doing. Create peer support groups, ask for mentor or supervisor meetings, and make sure to create boundaries between work and your personal life. And then relational, cut out any toxic relationships, identify individuals at work who can check in on you, spend ample time with trusted friends and family, seek support from your partner or spouse, and maintain boundaries with patients and coworkers. As the old adage goes, you can't pour from an empty cup. By neglecting our needs and ignoring internal cues, we're actually limiting our ability to adequately care for others. When caring for someone experiencing trauma, illness, or disease, setting boundaries can feel really difficult. And our natural instinct as humans is to show empathy and care when exposed to another person's suffering. While it may seem counterintuitive, being able to set and maintain boundaries actually allows us to care for individuals more fully because we can take a more holistic approach and a view of their needs rather than getting too close to the objective. Whether comprised of work colleagues who understand our daily challenges or those who work in different industries, social support networks help us recharge and feel known by others. Whether participating in a book club, grabbing a coffee, playing board games, surrounding ourselves with others who know us well provides an opportunity for replenishment. And these friends may also be able to identify signs of compassion fatigue that we didn't even recognize in ourselves. And I'll leave you with this quote from August 2020 that a graduate resident that provided for a research project that I currently am working on with Dr. Archea, MJ, and Jay. And it reminds me that our job puts us in a wild position to take part in both the most intimate and often most unfortunate moments in other people's lives, and how that line can blend seemingly into our lives as well. And it's confronting to be bombarded with the awful stuff that exists. And just remember to sometimes stop and take time to make that self-other distinction. So it just says, let me just try to make this bigger. So you did just what you thought. And when I look now to all those hot pockets in the United States, like Florida and Texas and California, and it's August 2020, we're in August, and our peak was in March and April. And you see these peaks where their ICUs are full and their hospital beds are full and they're running out of PPE. Part of me is angry because it's so long. And we were so vocal and we rang the bells so loudly of how badly this thing is. And so all that time feels a little wasted. And all those patients who are dying unnecessarily feels very much in vain. Like our efforts and our New York Times articles and our Facebook posts and all those kinds of things are falling on deaf ears. But at the same time, I really do empathize with the sentiment that you can't understand how horrifying COVID surge looks until you've seen it with your own eyes. There's no way to quantify or relay the lost looks and the hopelessness and the fear in the patients and the overwhelming scene that unfolds when you have a peak the way we had in March and April without seeing it for yourself. There's no way, no matter how much you say and describe it, it can only take you so far. So when I see now that these peaks are happening, I have to imagine that it's so novel and it's so unique in its presentation and how it manifests that there's no way we could have done any more until they've seen it with their own eyes, until you've been touched yourself, which is terrible. You can't really appreciate how hopeless and how terrible this virus manifests in real life. So it's annoying, but I kind of get it. Who could have described what we saw in March to us before it hit us? We wouldn't have believed them. There's no way to really relay this kind of experience. So now I'd like to just kind of open up to the group because I know it's been like a difficult past month, especially for the juniors who I think that from our perspective as some of the seniors, we tend to just be like, oh, we'll never be bad as 2020. But I think that when you haven't had that experience, or even if you had, it's still very rough. And I almost found this past year more difficult for me from a fatigue perspective than the first wave. And I'm not sure if other people felt like that, but I just wanted this to be like an open time for people to talk or to add whatever they wanted.